The Las Vegas Raiders, their offseason in 60 seconds. Hired Tom Telesco as the GM. Still can't believe that happened. Antonio Pierce retained as their head coach. Luke Getsy comes in as their offensive coordinator. A couple other offensive assistants that they brought in. Joe Philbin, Rich Scangarello as their quarterback coach. Acquisitions, signed Christian Wilkins to a 4-year, $110 million deal with $83 million guaranteed. Good for you, Christian Wilkins. Brought in Gardner Minshew on a 2-year, $25 million deal with $15 guaranteed. He is the starting quarterback for this team in week 1. Lost Josh Jacobs, Bilal Nichols, Jermaine Illuminor, Amik Robertson, Jimmy Garoppolo, Greg Van Roten, all in free agency. They cut Jimmy Garoppolo. Beller, you could just say it. You don't have to be gracious to Jimmy Garoppolo. Drafted Brock Bowers in the first round, Jackson Powers Johnson in the second round, DJ Glaze in the third round. DJ Glaze is an offensive tackle. I should probably mention that. I don't think he's on a first name basis with a lot of our audience.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's probably good to mention that the random third round tackle, who I don't even know if he was projected to go that high, went that high. So it's a good one to shout out.
Blue chip check-in for the Las Vegas Raiders.
Obviously, you have to start with Max Crosby. He is probably their best player at this point. Davante Adams is, he probably gets almost forgotten about now because of how weird last year was, but he is still a top 3, top 4 receiver in the league. He's amazing. I'm willing to give Christian Wilkins the graduation because I think for a long time he was in that next tier for me. And the reason being, he was not a good run defender. He was a bad run defender kind of earlier on in his career. I think he has finally gotten to the point where he is not only a very good pass rusher, a very flexible pass rusher, but he is actually really good at holding his gap in the run game now. He's a much more disciplined player. He doesn't get run over in double teams the way that he used to. So I'm willing to give him the graduation there.
I can't do it. There are too many good defensive tackles in the league for me to say that he's a blue chip player.
Is that his fault that there's just a lot of other good guys at the position?
You have to be a top 10 player at your position for you to be a blue chip guy, in my mind.
I mean, that's fair. I just don't want to punish a guy for there being a glut of really good players at a position.
All right, if we're going to frame it as blue chip guy means that you're a difference maker at your position, in a certain tier of player, I guess that I'd be fine giving it to Christian Wilkins. But I do think that he is a slight step down from the true elite players at that spot.
I think that's fair.
I like him, and we'll get into why I think he fits with the rest of this group, but I'm not quite there quite yet. I had the red chips. I had Christian Wilkins, and I put Colton Miller in there as well. I think Colton Miller is a very solid left tackle. Other than that,
that's where it gets tough for me because in my mind, Christian Wilkins is clearly a tier above what Colton Miller is, which is not to say that Colton Miller is bad. It's just that to me, that is clearly a different level of player. So maybe we almost need 3 tiers here.
Yeah, we probably need some middle stage here. I think that's probably fair. All right, significant question marks in your mind about the Raiders depth chart. What do you got for me?
Still a lot of the pieces on defense. I know they played really, really well last year, but they drafted Tyree Wilson, and I don't know if he's been what they wanted him to be. And I think preseason,
he's definitively not been.
Yeah, he's definitively not been. And I don't think the preseason returns this year have been that promising. And then the secondary, there's just a lot of questions. I think there are potential answers to those questions, good ones, but just a lot of questions still. And then it almost goes without saying, but the quarterback position.
Quarterback, I think, is number 1. And then I think just general depth on defense is what I would say. Edge depth, cornerback depth. If you look at the starting 11, I think this defense has a lot of promise. And we saw them play really well last year when they stayed healthy. But if they lose anybody, I think that some of the talent on the margins is definitely worth bringing up. What do you watch in the first month of the year with this Raiders team?
Like I said, that secondary. I think there is a chance this secondary could be good. I really liked Trevin Merrick coming out of college, and I think if Patrick Graham's defense can be unlocked a little bit more, I think Merrick is actually a really good player for that defense. Marcus Epps, in a very streamlined role, can actually be an effective player. Jack Jones was obviously awesome when he got there last year. And then I think they like Jacorian Bennett. It's just, for me, it's kind of a question mark, and I'm not 100% sure he's really going to be the guy they want him to. Nate Hobbs is obviously okay too at the nickel spot. So it's kind of just a matter of how good can the secondary be, and does that change at all what Patrick Graham wants to be? I actually, as I did more research, ended up almost answering my own question on Graham. I went back and looked at what his coverage rates were when he was the play caller with the Giants. it's almost like within 1 or 2 percentages in every coverage category, exactly what the Raiders were doing last year. So it might just be he calls what he calls, and you're just praying the young guys can play better.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because the departure of what he was when he was in Miami is the biggest. That's been the biggest transition for him. Is he was a man-heavy guy when he was with Dolphins because that's how they were built, and then for the most part over the last few years, he's transitioned to just like a zone-heavy, disguise-heavy sort of approach on defense. And mine is mostly, can this defense be what it was in the back half of last season? Like this was a top 10-ish unit. They were 11th in defensive success rate in the second half of the year. They were 5th in EPA per play. 16.3% of opponent drives last season for the Raiders ended in a touchdown. Only the Patriots were better over the second half of the season. Is that real? Like, is that something that you can carry over into this year? That's my biggest question. That's what I'm looking at.
I think schedule is going to play a huge deal in this because last year, other than obviously that Patrick Mahomes Christmas game where he seemed like he wanted to go home and celebrate with his family. Like that whole game for everybody just went horribly wrong on the Chiefs. Other than that game, they played a lot of really bad quarterbacks, like backups and guys who just weren't ever going to be that good from the start. So I am curious. That's really my biggest question is if they have to play more actual real quarterbacks, can they hold up? Which again is basically just a proxy for the secondary.
That's kind of where I sit. It's like, is this real over the course of an entire and other NFL season? And I do think that some of the core ideas of who they are defensively, I like. Like if you look at it, only 3 teams in the NFL last year, and this is just one example, only 3 teams in the NFL last year played more cover 2 when they lined up with one high safety than the Raiders did. Like what they were doing on the back end and some of the disguise that we saw, I mean, it was right in line with some of the hardest to pin down defenses in the NFL. And I
That's
think when
Spag
you
stuff right there.
yeah, and he worked with Steve Spagnuolo. I mean, Patrick Graham at one point was with Steve Spagnuolo, and I talked to Patrick Graham at training camp. He's somebody that I'd want to talk to for years because I just think that he's done a really good job with the pieces that he's been given multiple times as a defensive coordinator. And what he was telling me is that it's twofold in terms of how they construct their plan going into a season. One, what do your players do well? I mean, that's where it starts. And yeah, I was asking him, you're a New England guy, but your defenses from a coverage menu perspective look nothing like a Bill Belichick team. Like, what are the things you learned when you were in New England that you feel like carry over to your approach now? And his answer was just, it starts with the players. Like it's always going to start with the players and trickle out from there. And the second layer to this, which I thought was really interesting, is he said, it's also about who you play. So if what I'm doing isn't going to work against the Chiefs, then it doesn't really make sense for this to be a foundational part of what my defense looks like.
Yeah, running
And
a bunch of man coverage against Patrick Mahomes, probably a bad idea, I would
and,
assume.
And so that being the foundation, because they share a division with Patrick Mahomes, and if they ever got to the playoffs, like that's the type of team that they would have to play against. I do think that makes sense. And those aren't revolutionary ideas, but just asking him kind of what that stuff was rooted in, I thought that answer was pretty telling. So that him as the defensive coordinator, I think he's consistently done a good job. And I do think they at least have interesting pieces at pretty much every level of this thing. And that's why I'm just curious to see what level they can get to after some of the flashes that we saw in the back half last year.
Interesting is the perfect word for this unit.
What is keeping you up at night with this year's Raiders team?
I'm not going to try to be interesting or cool.
There's
here.
no need to be. We have to talk about it at some point.
Yeah, it's very obviously the quarterback situation. And the thing is, we could just start by saying the names Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell, and that alone kind of, makes it a question mark. But I think to me, the bigger question is when Gardner Minshew played relatively well last year, when he produced well, let me say that, when he put up numbers last year, it was with a play caller that we both kind of think is next up, right? Like Shane Steichen is probably right in that knocking on the door tier for being one of those absolute just best play callers in the league.
What I love about that is that he's weird. Like he's not just from the same tree. It's not a branch off of the same ideas that we're used to. The fact that he could be among that group and he's doing it in a completely different way than a lot of the other guys who've taken over the league. That's why I think that he is such a fun entry into that club because it's unlike anybody else that has reached that level in the league over the last few years in terms of what they're trying to do.
No, that's spot on. Like outside of your staples in Andy Reid and Sean Payton, who are older and have been doing this a long time, almost all of the other top offensive mind guys are like Shanahan system type guys, which is
Yeah.
fine. Like that's just the offense du jour. But like it, like you said, it's cool that Shane Steichen has kind of branched out and been something different. I'm not sure Gardner Minshew is going to play as well outside of the Shane Steichen, system there. So that's kind of my biggest concern here.
What I mean, you went back and you charted Minshew from last season. I mean, you have a sense of who he was at his most recent stop. How do you think what he's bringing to the position aligns with what Luke Getsy is going to ask of him in this kind of like Green Bay adjacent offensive system that they're going to run?
I don't love it because I think if you look at the personnel and you look at what the offense is supposed to be, they want to be in under center. We're going to kind of get into some heavier formations with these two tight ends. We're going to maybe want to do play action stuff over the middle of the field. That is all pretty much to me antithetical of what Gardner Minshew has been good at. When Gardner Minshew has played relatively good football, it's been we're going to spread the ball out, we're going to RPO, we're going to let him kind of do his thing in the quick game. And then because we're kind of throwing so much, we're going to get maybe 2 or 3 plays where he does something out of the pocket. And some games, maybe that's the worst thing in the world, but there are other games where he actually makes some game-changing plays for you, and you can actually march down the field and somehow get 60 yards out of nowhere because he makes some ridiculous throw outside the numbers. So that to me is where the question marks come in. It just seems misaligned. I think is probably the best way to put it.
Do you think that the rest of the offense, just from a personnel perspective, can do enough of the heavy lifting here? Because part of me thinks the answer is yes. Like Davante Adams is still a superstar level player. I think Jacoby Myers is a very good NFL receiver. The tight ends, reason to be excited about it. We'll talk about it in a second. Zamir White last year was ninth in the NFL in yards after contact per rush. Like, I don't think Zamir White is a superstar, but I do think that he's probably a capable NFL running back if you put him into a decent situation with a decent offensive line. And I do think that this group up front, there's not a lot of stars, but I think they have a chance to get there. Like if Jackson Powers Johnson is capable from day one, you have Dylan Parham going into year two. Thayer Munford is still the starting right tackle, and the reason is that he's been able to stave off a guy like Glaze, and they felt comfortable going into the season with him as a starter. Like this could be a average to slightly below average offensive line, and you combine that with the weapons, it's like, all right, like could he do just enough to get this offense to average or slightly above average? Is it crazy to think that that's possible? I think the
One
floor is underneath the ground, by the way. I want to acknowledge that before we go any further, but I'm trying to play devil's advocate a little bit about what the upside case could look like.
I would say one of Luke Getsy or Gardner Minshew has to be somebody we haven't seen before. Like they have to be a different version of themselves than we've seen before. Like Getsy's offense has to be different than what he's used to, or Gardner Minshew has to be not the quarterback that he's been for 5 years. So I
The
just don't know.
quarterback or the play caller have to be a different person is not
Yes,
a good argument for why that you should, for like your rosy case about the offense.
it could
Oh
happen. I
God.
don't know.
That's really good. Yeah, I mean, mine is, does the quarterback turn into a pumpkin with lesser play calling? Like that's what's keeping me up at night. The other one I will say is the second outside cornerback spot, just because they couldn't address it the way that they wanted to. Obviously, they had the 13th pick in the draft. They were in a position potentially to take a corner if they wanted to take a corner. My understanding is that they looked at that pick and said, look back at our draft history over the last 5 years. This needs to be a double off the wall. This needs to be a guy that is going to contribute for us. And there is no better option at that spot in this draft, even if it doesn't necessarily fit with the other pieces you have, than Brock Bowers. Like, I think the Brock Bowers pick was rooted in, we need an NFL player with this selection, and then we will figure the rest out later. And the corner just never came. So they had to address it a little bit later in the draft. And now they're just trying to figure that spot out. I get the argument for that, but it leaves you with the cornerback room that they're dealing with right now. What are you most excited about with this year's Raiders team?
You just kind of spoiled it. These tight ends, man. I mean, so we'll start with Brock Bowers because he's the new guy in town. Brock Bowers, man, he is just. So I think what I want to say about Brock Bowers is I think, got pinned as this guy who is really athletic, really good with the ball in his hands, really, really good in space, kind of the way that George Kittle is. I think his ball skills got really underrated over the course of like the draft season, or not, maybe not necessarily underrated, but it just seemed like we didn't talk about that part of his game. There were so many clips where he's just like catching a seam ball behind his back. He's making some crazy catches underneath where like somebody's just hitting him in the ribs and he doesn't care and he brushes it off and he catches it. His ball skills are really, really good. And I think he's an undersized guy and he's never going to be a inline Y, completely kick your ass type of tight end. But he's a good blocker for a guy his size. Like he's going to be able to get it done. And then Michael Mayer is it's in some ways the inverse, where he is, I think, a true inline Y, where he can actually be a pretty solid blocker, be your guy who's doing a lot more of the dirty work. He is not nearly as athletic as Bowers is. I think he moves well for a guy who is much larger, but he's not quite as explosive as Bowers. And then Mayer's ball skills. I just talked about how good Bowers are. Mayer, I swear to God, at Notre Dame caught everything in his vicinity. Like if it was even on the same screen when you're watching him, it was going to be in his hands and he was going to catch it.
It's so funny that we have two tight ends on this team that their biggest strength as college prospects was pass catching. Like that's not normally the case. Like typically when you have a team that's going to live in 12 personnel, one guy is a stronger blocker than the other. And even if Mayer is his body type would allow him to be the Y in a way that Bowers never would. Like Michael Mayer's selling point at Notre Dame is that he was an incredible receiver. Like he was the focal point of their passing game. So to have two of those guys on the same NFL offense, like I think about a team like the Bills, right? Where you have Dawson Knox and Dalton Kincaid. Like Dawson Knox can catch the ball, but the selling point for him is that he can do a little bit of everything. He is an inline player. Like Michael Mayer was as productive of a college receiver at tight end as a lot of guys we've seen come through in the last few years. To have two of those guys on the same team is just a different collection of talents at the position than we typically see.
No, you're right. And the thing is, I think if you just said that to me, like just, we brought in two really young guys who are really good to sell with pass catching, I'd be like, that's really what you want to do with your 12 personnel. But they both, to me, hit the threshold of what you need to be as a blocker. So it's not like you're throwing guys like out there like Sam Laporta and Dalton Kincaid, who I don't think hit that threshold yet. These guys can do it.
So here's the thing about this, though. We've talked about this a little bit. What matchups are you creating with your 12 personnel? Where are you going to find matchup advantages? And I think part of the problem with some of these teams is with their more slot kind of detached tight end in those 12 personnel looks, are you actually able to have matchup advantages against slot corners? With Brock Bowers, I think the answer to that might be yes.
Emphatically yes.
So I think that's the difference with this team is that he is such a dynamic receiver that you really are able to live in 12 personnel that feels like 11 and still have passing game advantages when your three guys who are your receivers in those looks are Davante Adams, Jacoby Myers, and Brock Bowers. You can cook with that, even though it's technically 12 personnel. And I think that's the reason I'm excited about how this will work and how this 12 personnel is different than a lot of other teams when they line up that way.
It's the inverse of the Rams, right? Where they're in 11, but it really feels like 12 because all those
Yes.
guys are kicking your ass. But now this is 12 that feels a little bit more like 11 because, they can actually throw out of these formations.
What I'm most excited about with the Raiders, I cannot wait to watch this pass rush group get after it on third down. Like this group at its best, you have Malcolm Kuntz, Max Crosby, Christian Wilkins, and potentially Tyree Wilson is slotted inside on third down. But even if you want to throw Adam Butler out there, I actually thought that John Jenkins and Adam Butler were pretty good for this team last year. They brought both of them back on short-term deals. They have cool kind of complementary skill sets. Like Butler is more of a penetrator. Jenkins is more of a space eater. So the idea of dropping Butler, Wilkins, Kuntz, and Crosby onto the field at the same time when it's 3rd and 8, from a talent perspective, it's really fun. But one of my favorite things about what Christian Wilkins does well and how it fits this team specifically, they run a shit ton of games and stunts. And Christian Wilkins is really, really good when you put him in those spots. Like when that Miami pass rush was cooking over the last few years, you had Jalen Phillips in 1B gap and, Christian Wilkins is the penetrator and Phillips is looping around. Like that's how he's been able to help unlock the players around him. And that's already how this group wants to play. So I just think stylistically, the marriage is already there. It's not just about going out and getting the best possible free agent. I actually do think he fits the way that they want to play. And I am really excited about what that can look like in defined pass rush situations.
And they didn't really have any creativity with that last year because they just couldn't. Like that's just not how the unit was built. So you bring in a guy like Wilkins, who you mentioned, I think on games and stuff, he's actually kind of good at both roles where he can be your penetrator pick guy, obviously, and he's really smart about how to buy that extra little bit of space. But then
Oh,
when
he
he's
does the
looping
Justin
around,
Smith special,
he
man.
does, dude.
Just one little grab of the shoulder pad as you're trying to free something up for somebody else.
That's a smart vet move. I mean, you got to give him credit. And then when he's like the looper, more than athletic to get around the edge and go make
Yeah.
those plays. So like he's just, I think, going to be a supercharge for this pass rushing unit for sure.
I am excited to watch that group unleashed. I do think that's going to be my favorite part of watching this team. Your most important supporting character for this year's Raiders team?
I again have one for each side of the ball. On offense, it's Trey Tucker, and I know we just talked about a lot of the other pass catchers with the tight ends and Davante Adams, Jacoby Myers. Tucker is kind of their best bet at getting vertical stretch, and obviously
Mhm.
Adams gives you some of that from the X position. Because even though he's a little bit older, he's still a dude who can run and win down the field. But Tucker can be your real, like, especially from the slot, just stretch the field and give these guys some space. So I think if he could be a functional player for them in that role, that would be really nice for kind of just making everybody's life easier, truthfully. And then for me, it's the linebackers. I kind of like Robert Spillane and Divine
So do
Diablo
I.
as like I think they're solid players, but to me, it's kind of just like, is there a little bit more we can find from these two players? Like just a little bit more.
I think Spillane is solid. I've always enjoyed him, and I thought that he actually played pretty well for this team last year. Diablo's obviously got his limitations. Like, he's undersized, and I think
Right.
that, that's worth considering. But I actually do stylistically enjoy Robert Spillane. So I'm maybe a little bit more optimistic about that group than you are heading into it.
I think that's
My,
fair.
Mine's Jack Jones. Like, if Jack Jones plays as well this year for 17 games, obviously with slight vacillations here and there, as he did for half of the season after getting dropped in here last year, that would be incredible. Like, they signed this guy off the street, and if he can give them that level of play, I think that goes a long way in making you feel better about some of the other question marks they have in the secondary. If one side is locked down and you feel good about Hobbs, and that Merrick, Marcus Epps kind of duo back there gives you solid enough safety play, solid enough veteran safety play. It makes me feel a little bit better that we don't have a solid answer at that other outside cornerback spot. And I think that Jack Jones goes a long way in kind of determining how that hierarchy feels overall.
I think that's 100% right. If he can, like you said, lock down one side of the field and the pass rush takes another step. I mean, they were already pretty good last year with just Max alone, basically, and Malcolm Kuntz, he was a solid player. But then you add Wilkins. If Jack Jones can really maintain that level, that is the high end for this defense is him doing that.
I already spoiled this a little bit because I thought that us coming to this answer independently of one another was very, very funny, and I tweeted it out. What counts as a successful season in your mind for this year's Raiders team?
I couldn't find an answer, man. Like there's just so
I,
many
I don't know what the
different.
answer is.
And here's the thing. When you did that with the Saints, it felt more like a apathy, right? Like it's just like who cares? This team isn't consequential. That's not actually how I feel about the Raiders. It's more genuine confusion. Is that I'm just not sure what the goal that they are trying to align to is.
Okay, so here are the two paths in my mind. One, you bottom out. You get the number one pick in the draft. You're able to like fully start a rebuild. But that is not in line with anything else that they've done over the last 2 years. And even with Telesco coming in, signing Christian Wilkins to that deal, Christian Wilkins is like a $33 million cap hit next year. You're not doing that if you think that you're some rebuilding team. So I almost think a backdoor path to the number one pick and a forced rebuild where you stumble into your next quarterback, that probably is a version of success, but not for the people who are in charge of running this organization. So the other side of it would be like the way that this group would see it based on the other decisions that they've made. Do you get to the end of the season and you say about the Raiders, man, if they just figure out the quarterback, this team could be really interesting. And you walk into next year, you got 40-ish million in cap space. You can move Davante's money around. You could free something up. And we're in a spot where we're saying, what if they could trade for Kirk Cousins? What if they could trade a second round pick for Kirk Cousins? Would that make this team relevant? Part of me thinks that tone and that like discussion around the Raiders would be success for them, but I don't know if that's right. I honestly think the other path where you just like start over, find the right rookie quarterback and start building this thing at the right pace, that's probably the better path.
Dude, calling them this year's Falcons, basically, that might stick with me. I think that's a really good comparison for I think what might end up happening here and what they might be going for.
I was about to say that I think the defense might be too good for them to bottom out. I don't think that's true. I think that the floor on offense is low enough that in the worst case scenario, this team could have the number 1 pick in the draft. So I think maybe for the long-term health of the organization, that might be the best case, but I don't think you can qualify that as a successful season.
That's the thing, is that even in that scenario where long-term that's probably good, that's not helpful for anybody who's there right now.
Yeah, because I think that if you're looking at the way this team has been constructed and you have hopes for them on defense, the fact that they could be the worst team in the league, like there's no way that's success based on the preseason expectations for this defensive group specifically. So it's just a hard team to figure out. If they can get to a place where we do think the right veteran quarterback could make this team relevant, I do think that is the best needle to possibly thread where the fan base would be happy and it's an acceptable path forward, even though the margin for error with that one does feel pretty small. Your irresponsible player prediction for this year's Raiders team.
This is honestly one of the more responsible takes I've had in this category, but I think Malcolm Kuntz can get to double-digit sacks. I think he got pretty close last year. He got to 8 sacks. And then I think if you just assume that Christian Wilkins is going to kind of supercharge this unit as a whole and kind of free up some other players and help them do that, Kuntz is very obviously their second best guy off the edge. He's going to get a ton of chances. I think it's pretty on the table for him.
Yeah, I like him a lot as a player. And he's hitting free agency this offseason, which is another thing to mention. Like, even if it goes well for this team and they have some cap space next year, Kuntz is a free agent, Merrick is a free agent, Epps is a free agent, Hobbs is a free agent, Spillane is a free agent. Like, it's just a strange team.
It's your whole starting 11 at that point.
I just don't really know what to make of it. Mine, this also isn't that spicy. I think both quarterbacks play at least 6 games. Like, I just imagine that we're going to see both of these guys at some point this season. I know that's not particularly interesting, but that's the most I could muster with this one.
I think, yeah, again, a team where it's hard to figure out some of these categories.